Hello Seekers and welcome back to the channel. We have another contender for the first prototype of hardcore techno. This one also comes from the Nordics, this time from the 1960s Denmark.
Greetings from the electric byway.
After I released the video on Kureniemi's Dance of the Anthropoids, I received some contenders for the first so-called prototype of hardcore techno music. If you haven't seen the video, I recommend you to check it out first for some context. I haven't been able to confirm the exact production year of some of the other contenders, like Take Me to Your Violin Teacher by Raymond Scott, and actually many of them were only released to the public afterwards in the last couple of decades. So far the criteria of who had the first physical release still goes to Kureniemi's track. But if you forget this criteria of early public physical release, there is one track that especially caught my attention. Before we get into the track and its creator, we need to talk about a particular element in hardcore music that is relevant for this particular case. But first, as a disclaimer, my intention here is not to discredit the founders of techno, hardcore or any other related music subcultures, all the respect to them too. The artist in this video most likely did not plan to create a subculture or a music genre. In the end, this is not really about competition, and this video is purely for music research and entertainment purposes. The focus of this video is intentionally narrowed down, and also one of the intentions of this channel is to talk especially about the more unknown pioneers as well as the current creators of electronic music. So I'm also not going to repeat too much already known popular electronic music history, and I hope to bring something new to the table with these videos as well. So let's get back to the topic. In the previous case of Anthropoids and Tanssi, I was looking at parallels on how very fast beats were made with a sequencer in the late 60s, getting that similar rush feeling as in the modern day speedcore music. In this video we will be focusing more on the element of distorted kick drums in the context of repetitive beats. Not necessarily the fastest beats, but the tempos will be somewhat fast too. In the 90s there were at least a few distinct music scenes where the musicians started modulating the kick drums on the go, so that the kick drums became something more than just one repeating sample. The distorted kick drums became more alive, kind of like the distorted guitars in heavy metal. These developments can be seen in the techno-derived industrial techno, the industrial and noise-derived and less DJ-friendly rhythmic noise, aka power noise, and most prominently in the various subgenres of hardcore. One of the earliest examples of such beats is in the track Bass Drum and Hi-Hats, made by the Belgian artist Wax and released in 1993. It sounds very similar to Hitchhiker, a track by Pilldriver, which is by the way another alias of Mark Acardipane, aka Mescalinum United, who we discussed in the previous video. The track was released 2 years later. Hitchhiker took the experiments even further and perfected it into something that we would hear a lot in later hardcore releases. Influenced by these developments, at the turn of the millennia, the 90s faster Dutch gabber sound started to give room for a slower and more sophisticated sound, where bigger bass drums and the modulation of their sounds were in the center. This style became known as new style. Later on in the 2000s it was known as mainstream hardcore, and nowadays it's already kind of old school and referred to as millennium hardcore. Intelligent Hardcore by The Dark Raver and DJ Vince from 1997 is sometimes regarded as one of the first tracks of this style, adding more dance floor appeal with the Hoover sounds. This became the hardcore festival sound of the time, and at the same time some subgenres such as industrial hardcore and darkcore were doing the same thing. Similar modulation of the kick drum and melodic use of the distortion was also happening in the faster and more underground and experimental styles of hardcore, at least from the mid-90s. But it can be said that the slower tracks left more room to appreciate the bigger kick drums. Although these experiments were already happening in the 90s, we often tend to divide hardcore between the time periods of the more stable kick drums of the 90s and the modulated kick drums of the 2000s. Instead of using the bass drum samples of drum machines, such as the legendary Roland TR-909, it also became more common to create the bass drums from scratch from a square wave and layering different parts together to create one massive kick drum. Around 2004 and 2005, I was listening to the Dutch radio show Kraak Piep Show, and they were referring to the method of twisting the equipment knobs of the synth or the drum machine as phreaking. Greetings to Dister and Exorcist, if you guys are watching this. DJ Promo from the third movement also has such a track called Freakious Pika from 2001. Especially the industrial hardcore enthusiasts of the time were looking for that perfect crunchy kick drum with a low bass that required a proper sound system to be enjoyed to its fullest. It seems that this trend settled down a bit when we come to the 2010s hardcore, but that's a story for another time. So we could say that this was a very specific time in the history of electronic hardcore dance music, but creating fast distorted beats from tones was technically possible a lot earlier, and had already been done actually at least by the 1960s. Thanks to Michael Lee, who gave the suggestion of a track called Beda. It was composed between 1962 and 1963 by the Danish composer Jørgen Plaetner, but it was only in 2003 that the track got released on a CD album titled Electronic Music, and it got some more public attention. Before we get into the track, let's take a look at its creator. Born in 1930 in Copenhagen, Jørgen Plaetner was one of the pioneers of electronic music in Denmark, as well as composing works for orchestra and ensembles, piano sonatas, and works for children and young people.
Plaetner først og fremmest komponist, og han tilhører den kreds af unge komponister, som man kalder avantgardisterne.
He created most of his 57 electronic music works between the years 1960 and 1974. In the 1950s, Plaetner was attending courses in Darmstadt, Germany, where he studied theory and acoustics with the composer Hermann Heiss. He was also listening to discussions of composers such as Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Herbert Eimert, Werner Meyer-Eppler, and other German electronic music pioneers. These German pioneers were definitely a big influence on Plaetner's own works as well. In 1960, Plaetner was proposing for the establishment of a cooperative electronic studio that could be shared 24 hours a day by other electronic musicians. Unfortunately, other Danish composers of the time were not interested in participating in this. In the end, Plaetner bought equipment that he could afford and built his own studio in his home in Kalundborg. This was most likely Denmark's first home studio of its kind, and this is also where he composed a track called Beda. In Beda we are also going back in time technologically speaking, from the 1968 Dance of Anthropoids, which was done on a sequencer. The working method here was a bit different and also more complicated than playing a jam on a sequencer and pumping out those beats.
Her så mit lille beskedne elektroniske laboratorium. Man skulle jo have en hel del flere instrumenter for at kunne lave den fuldendte elektroniske musik. Jeg har en sinusgenerator, en firkantgenerator, som kan fremstille grundelementerne i en lydreproduktion. Jeg har et oscilloskop, som man kan se lydkurverne i, altså hvad man har fremstillet. Og jeg har her et antal båndoptagere, som er nødvendige for reproduktionen af lyden.
It had to be a bit more handcrafted, and Plaetner was working on it from 1962 until 1963. The pulsing, overdriven beat of Beda is very close to something that you could hear in an improvised industrial hardcore jam. The kick pulses are not as punchy and refined, but definitely more impressive for its time than Kuraniemi's experiment. The tempo of the track is more than 180 BPM, so it's not as fast, but it does contain some faster elements as well. It's interesting to think that instead of drum machine samples that predated the use of tone kicks in hardcore in the 90s, the kicks in this track were actually created from synthetic tones by changing their pitch with the tape machine.
Alle disse toner kan så indspilles på bånd, overlagres og klippes i de ønskede længder og tider. Alle tonerne er klippet således at de er lige lange. En blanding af disse sinustoner og få en ønsket klangvirkning. Det er altså ikke eksperimentelt, men altså man kan ganske nøje forudlægge et klangligt forløb.
From 1979 until his death in summer of 2002, Plaetner lived in Kårahult in Sweden, where he was a member of the composers group Media Arts in Växjö. His most active time with electronic music was in the 60s and 70s, but it seems that his pioneer work in Denmark only became truly appreciated until later on, when his music was released after his death. Denmark is of course known for hardcore artists such as Lundsten and Peckerhead. I decided to ask them and some others, but they had never heard of Plaetner or Beda, so there doesn't seem to be much continuity between the local hardcore scene and the early avant-garde experiments. I think Beda comes quite close to what hardcore is about, but what do you think? Hardcore techno as a concept, of course, did not exist in the 1960s, and in a similar way, 60 years from now, people might talk about some musical experiments of our present time as a precursor to something that is an organized scene in their time. But regardless of definitive scene borders, it's interesting to see how people in the past have tuned into specific energies, and how the basic techniques are still somewhat similar to some degree in our current era of digital and analog music. In the future we are also going to be tuning into similar energies of even more ancient past. Thanks a lot for the many recommendations in the previous video, and feel free to recommend more such early examples. It would be useful to know the year when they were recorded as well. Thanks for watching, and see you next time on Electric Byway. And do remember to check out some live electronic music pioneers on the channel as well.